Imagine standing with 500 armored men while 26,000 enemies spread across the horizon. Imagine bandaged hands under gauntlets, a king carried on a litter because his body can no longer hold a saddle, and the sun baking the dust into the air like smoke. Numbers pointed towards certain annihilation. Instead, that day would rewrite how Europe measured courage, command, and the limits of a massed army. Nothing prepared Europe for what 500 knights would do. If you want to see the full tactical breakdown and an animated map of the march and charge, stay with us to the end. By late November 1177, the map of the Levant looked like a story at its breaking point. Saladin, having unified Egypt and Syria, had become the single most potent Muslim military and political force in the region. His army, variously reported by contemporaries at around 20 to 26,000, presented itself not as a single tight column, but as a massive, confident presence, ready to sweep into the Kingdom of Jerusalem and finish what years of war had left unfinished. Jerusalem's Christian realm was thinly held. Castles needed men, garrisons were stretched, the treasury was not inexhaustible. The political scene in the Crusader states had its own fractures, rival nobles, fresh wounds from earlier campaigns, and a kingdom that revolved more than ever around one central, frail figure, Baldwin IV. Baldwin was not merely a king in title. He had been a symbol, both inspiring and tragic. Leprosy had hollowed his face and crippled his limbs, yet contemporaries described a presence that commanded attention when he entered a hall or a battlefield. He sometimes appeared with his face masked, not to hide the disease from the formal world alone, but because his visage had become a public sign of endurance and divine testing. Physical weakness and political authority coexisted awkwardly, yet his presence on the field, in that climate of suspicion and fear, mattered more than any muster of banners might suggest. Alongside Baldwin stood men whose names would be recorded in the chronicles: Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, the Templars being a military order of monks and fighters, Raymond of Tripoli, and a scattering of secular lords whose obligations bound them to the royal cause. But obligations were not the same as certainty. Many in the kingdom expected the worst. How could 500 heavy cavalry, knights in mail and plate, each supported by men-at-arms, stand against a force that outnumbered them by dozens? How could a king who sometimes needed to be carried, who had moved across the countryside on a litter, command the kind of operation that modern generals would call audacious and suicidal? The decision came at a council in Jerusalem, where time had been measured in rumors and the horizon in dust clouds. Chroniclers record that Baldwin, despite his illness, refused the easy route, flight to the coast and safety. He chose instead to confront the threat before it dissolved the kingdom's heart. That choice was not mere bravado. It was a political calculation with military dimensions. To abandon the feudally lands meant inviting occupation. To let Saladin ravage the countryside would strip the kingdom of its capacity to feed garrisons and pay for future defenses. Yet the march Baldwin ordered was not a leisurely campaign. It would be a forced march, an all but impossible push to close ground in the shortest possible time. A forced march, in medieval terms, meant pushing men and horses beyond normal rest intervals, riding through the night and accepting predictable losses in mounts and morale in exchange for strategic surprise. Baldwin's column would cover roughly 45 miles in about 36 hours. Think of 2 days in which riders sleep little, food is scant, the noise of armor becomes a constant friction, and horses inhale dust as if it were another enemy. Litter bearers strain, standard bearers count banners in the dark. Scouts ride ahead and return with reports that can change the fate of the march. Each hour pulled the army out of comfortable predictability and toward an outcome where endurance, not numbers, would decide. The march itself becomes a study in human cost. Horses collapse from exhaustion. Riders smear honey and salt into wounds to keep their mounts moving. Men strip limb by limb to dry off sweated hems and rewrap bandages. Some knights, despite their status, ride with the hair of their faces singed by the sun. The king is leveled by his condition, but raised by his will. He is taken forward on his litter through a landscape that will demand everything of everyone. While Baldwin was burning through time and bodies to close with the enemy, Saladin did something typical of large medieval armies and fatal in this case. He dispersed. When a large army occupies hostile country, foraging becomes as important as formation. Men need grain, horses need forage, and tents require fuel. Armies break into foraging parties that spread across the countryside. Supply wagons trail behind, and soldiers scatter in search of plunder.
Contemporary Muslim chroniclers would later stress that Saladin's force was confident and, by their reports, had the air of a campaign already won. The banners had been raised, the treasury had been prepared for occupation, and commanders began to send small detachments to live off the land. This dispersion is not a sign of negligence so much as a default of logistics. Large armies cannot keep every soldier tightly concentrated for long. To do so would starve the force. But it is a gamble. The gamble hinges on the assumption of clear superiority, that even if a part is struck, the rest can converge and reassert control. Saladin and his commanders judged the risk. They accepted it.
What they did not expect was a lightning strike in the form of a concentrated, well-led cavalry maneuver, delivered at the precise moment when those foraging detachments had created gaps wide enough to be exploited. At dawn, Baldwin's scouts reported what made the forced march worthwhile. The enemy, while massive on the map, was not arrayed in battle order. Reports described tents and gathered spoil rather than spear-formed lines. From a distance, the force looked whole, but the scouts could see the fissures, the points where scattered detachments left the main body vulnerable. To Baldwin and his commanders, a different kind of map emerged, one of timing. The king had sacrificed his advantage in numbers, he had none, to buy what he needed most in that moment, surprise. Baldwin's eyes did more than feed courage. They read terrain. The battlefield they chose was not a flat plain of cavalry maneuver, but a landscape laced with ravines and gullies, dry, steep channels cut into the soil that could act like funnels. To anyone who understood cavalry behavior, these features were alarms and opportunities. A fleeing horse will follow the line of least resistance. A pursued rider will seek a slope to escape or gallop through open ground that offers speed. But if that speed becomes direction, if 1,000 riders funnel into a narrow corridor, their numbers become a trap. What looks like a mass can become a column, and a column can be slaughtered in a choke. The plan that followed combined three elements: momentum, shock, and terrain. The Templars formed the spearhead. A spearhead, known in contemporary terms as a wedge, concentrates force at a single point to break an enemy line. Behind them rode the secular knights, noble cavalry not bound to monastic vows, but to feudal ties and chivalric obligation, ready to exploit any breach the Templars created. Infantry, often dismissed by modern imaginations of medieval warfare, but crucial in this moment, were placed to do what heavy horse could not: wheel and strike at flanks, cut off retreat paths, and secure kill zones. The idea was not to win a prolonged melee, but to turn a fragmentary engagement into a systemic collapse. The charge unfolded with the sudden, terrible clarity of a collapsing roof. Imagine the Templar wedge, standards snapping like blades against wind, heads low with lances couched for impact. The charge's first touch mattered more than anything. If the spear broke through, then momentum would do the rest. When impact came, it was not simply metal upon metal. Horses met other horses, and the thunder of a concentrated cavalry charge has its own psychology. Horses, trained for tumult yet sensitive to sudden changes, can panic when ranks burst and humans fall. Armor amplifies the shock. When lances shatter, they create space and panic both. The Templars pierced toward the heart of a foraging detachment, and the hole they made was swift. Secular knights poured through that gap, widening it, turning shock into a rolling catastrophe. The infantry, previously hidden or held back to avoid being trampled by their own cavalry, now swept in from the flanks. The geography of ravines did its work. Fleeing cavalry found themselves channeled into narrow gullies and bends, where momentum turned into bottleneck. What had been a tactical advantage for a larger army, space to maneuver and scatter, proved a liability when those spaces were cut into corridors by the local topography. One of the most striking ingredients in the collapse was the failure of elite troops to hold their nerve. Among Saladin's forces were Mamluks, slave soldier cavalry who formed an elite, highly trained corps. The Mamluks had a reputation for discipline and skill. Yet in the fog of the charge, with detachments scattered and command signals scrambled, even elite units can find themselves isolated. Panic is infectious. If you become isolated from the larger body of an army, the psychological cost can outweigh the physical. Uncertainty breeds a fear that turns ordered withdrawal into chaotic rout. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, recorded scenes that read almost like a theater of sudden ruin. A Muslim chronicler later characterized the day in spiritual terms. The language is that of divine favor and human failure, while Christian writers framed it as a miraculous vindication of courage. Modern historians judge such interpretations as contemporaneous attempts to explain events that, in military terms, can be accounted for by speed, concentration, and the exploitation of terrain. The chronicler's language matters because it shaped Europe's reaction. For readers at home in France, England, and the Rhineland, the tales that streamed back told a story in which a weak king and a handful of knights had checked the juggernaut of Saladin. Whether they labeled it miraculous or tactical, the message was the same. Something unexpected had just reshaped the strategic arithmetic of the Levant.
The pursuit after the initial collision compounded the disaster for Saladin's dispersed force. What begins as controlled advance can become a rout when cavalry, pursuing plunder, barrel into constrained ground. The ravines funneled flight into kill zones created by prepared infantry and reformed cavalry lines. Horses struggled, riders were unseated and trampled, formations that could have rallied into secondary lines could not find space to breathe. In the chaos, Saladin himself made a decision that would be recorded by chroniclers. He fled the field on a camel. That image, an iconic ruler abandoning an immediate battlefield, was not so much an indictment as a pragmatic move to preserve command and avoid capture. Leaders who survive can later reconstitute forces. Leaders who perish often drag the polity with them. Still, for the morale of the moment, the sight of the enemy's leader leaving had a seismic effect.
Estimates of casualties and captures vary. Later chroniclers, always working with a mix of reportage and rhetoric, place numbers in a range. Modern historians privilege caution and often interpret medieval figures as approximate rather than exact. Contemporary Christian accounts celebrated thousands of enemy dead and a great haul of treasure and war material taken by the Christians. Muslim accounts admitted heavy losses and stressed the surprise of the day while emphasizing Saladin's continued resilience in the campaign at large. It is safe to say that the result was decisive in its immediate material effect. Supply wagons, tents, and equipment meant for occupation were taken. Prisoners were brought back, and a treasury intended for the support of an occupation force fell into Christian hands. Those spoils were not merely riches. They were the fuel that kept garrisons in the field, paid for repairs and fortifications, and bought time to reorganize. That time mattered. The victory halted the immediate threat to Jerusalem and bought the kingdom breathing room measured in months and years, not days. Fortifications could be reinforced, recruits could be sought in Europe with a bolstered tale to tell, castles could be provisioned. It is crucial to appreciate the political currency of a military victory in the medieval Mediterranean. A single day's outcome could shift perceptions, encourage recruitment, and attract funds. Europe was not only watching the reality of battlefield outcomes, it was also consuming the story that came back from the Levant. When that story depicted that 500 knights had blunted a great tide, the result was a pulse of propaganda that reshaped expectations and stirred imaginations. Why did Europe feel stunned? Part of the shock was arithmetic. Western chroniclers, court poets, and clerical scribes relished the improbable image, a handful of knights against a sea of enemies. That image translated into a powerful message at home that courage, discipline, and divine favor could triumph over overwhelming odds. For a continent still invested in the rhetoric of crusade, such stories fed recruitment and reinforced the belief that God's justice could and did play a visible role in warfare. Even if modern historians reject the literal claim of supernatural intervention, they recognize that the narrative function of such claims, especially in mobilizing support, was vital. Another part of Europe's reaction was reputational. The military orders, especially the Templars, were defined by valor and sacrifice. Their central role in the charge gave them renewed prestige and a narrative to present to patrons across Christendom. Nobles who had sponsored knights saw their investments vindicated. Potential recruits saw a path to glory. The papal and royal courts in Europe found in the victory a useful symbol for both piety and martial prowess.
The image of a physically broken king pushing his army through exhaustion to a battlefield victory also provided a potent story arc. Weakness transformed into a kind of sacred authority, and suffering became a public virtue. Tempered against that elation is the sober long view. The victory did not erase the strength of Saladin's polity. Over the following years, he rebuilt and reasserted power across Syria and Egypt. The strategic map of the Levant continued to shift in fits and starts. Baldwin's death and the political fragility that his illness underscored meant that the victory could not convert into permanent hegemony for the Crusader states. The success bought a precious interval for the Christians, a decade in which walls could be strengthened and diplomacy pursued, but it did not create a forever. The later, larger campaigns under Saladin would reconquer Jerusalem in 1187, reminding historians that a single tactical triumph, however dramatic, cannot substitute for structural advantage. The military analysis yields a clear checklist of why the day went so decisively in Baldwin's favor. First, surprise. The forced march collapsed space and time, delivering the Crusader force into contact at a moment when enemy foraging had thinned an otherwise massive army. Second, concentration. 500 knights focused in a tight wedge produce force that, when applied at a point of weakness, creates a cascade effect. Third, terrain. The ravines acted as force multipliers for an attack on a dispersed opponent by converting open space into narrow slaughter paths. Fourth, psychology. Panic spreads faster than formations. An elite guard isolated from its main body faces the same fear as any levy. Finally,
leadership under adversity. Baldwin's example, even when the king could not fight from horseback, created a coherence of will among commanders that timed the attack and refused retreat. Equally important is what the day exposed about large army behavior. Numbers can be conveniences more than assets if they induce laxity in logistics and command. An army's strength is not a simple function of its headcount. It is a function of coordination, supply, and psychological coherence. Saladin's victory in unifying Egypt and Syria had depended upon brilliant long-term organization. His failure in this instance, if failure it was, came from the short-term logistics of occupation and the predictable dispersal of men for forage. That dispersal turned an aggregate advantage into a brittle assemblage vulnerable to focused violence. The immediate material gains, the captured treasury, the tents, the spoils, provided long-term strategic dividends. Money flowed back into the kingdom's coffers, enabling pay and repairs that in turn propped up defensive networks across the coast and inland strongholds. Garrisons could be paid and kept, siege equipment could be repaired.
Such material windfalls rarely create empires, but they buy survival and time, two outcomes that in medieval politics can be indistinguishable from victory. Psychologically, the day was a crack across the confidence of the Muslim world and a thunderclap of exhilaration in Christendom. Muslim chroniclers recorded wounds to honor and the necessity of rebuilding morale. Their narratives emphasized Saladin's resilience and tactical competence after the defeat. Christian chroniclers framed the event in more providential terms, but even those accounts repeatedly returned to the practical truth that a smaller, disciplined force striking at the right moment can shatter a larger force that has become careless. This fracture in expectation, numbers versus morale, left Europe rethinking the balance sheet of medieval warfare. A continent accustomed to formulas of feudal levies and princely retinues saw a lesson that would echo in recruitment, in the funding of military orders, and in the rhetoric of crusading. Tales of a leper king who would not yield, of Templars and knights who charged in disciplined wedges, and of mounted mass broken by ravines, traveled across courts and monasteries. For some, the event reinforced belief in divine favor. For others, it reinforced a practical doctrine: training, discipline, and leadership can outweigh simple mass. Yet the end of the story remains balanced. The victory did not resolve the strategic problem that faced the Crusader states. A decade of relative stability should not be mistaken for a permanent victory. Saladin regrouped. Political fortunes continued to swing. The recapture of Jerusalem by Muslim forces a decade later would show how temporary that respite had been. But temporariness does not erase consequence. The day when 500 knights confronted a dispersed host and turned rout into capture and plunder reshaped reputations and postponed the inevitable. It allowed castles to be reforged, diplomatic ties to be strengthened, and voices in Europe to claim that courage had bought time. So why was Europe unprepared? Partly because perception is slower than reality. European audiences had expectations about how many men made a battle decisive. The more, the better. That intuition remains persuasive to laymen and statesmen alike. The battlefield that November exposed a more complex arithmetic. Numbers must be coherent to be effective. Europe's shock was not simply at the seeming underdog triumphing. It was at the clarity with which one day disproved a comfortable numerical theology. The lesson was uncomfortable and intoxicating at once. A hand of iron guided by precise timing and terrain can cleave what numbers alone cannot protect. If historians or chroniclers of the time reached for divine explanations, that is itself part of the story. Religious language, chants, prayers, and post-battle assessments filled many chronicles because the medieval mind read providence into history.
Christian chroniclers spoke of God's favor. Muslim writers recorded similar appeals to divine will when they explained defeat and recovery. Modern readers should treat such language as evidence of perception, not proof of metaphysical causation. The battlefield will not yield easy, singular answers. It will offer a weave of logistics, leadership, terrain, psychology, and political consequence. Each thread matters. The tactical replay of the day is instructive in concrete terms. Start the animation by showing the broad dispersion of Saladin's forces as they forage across a wide area, dotted with supply trains and tents. Then trace Baldwin's forced march, flat lines plunging through the countryside toward a vulnerable seam. Zoom in as scouts confirm gaps. Now bring in the wedge, the Templars at the tip, secular knights following, infantry ready on flanks. Watch momentum create a hole. See the ravines on the map compress fleeing cavalry into narrow corridors where the infantry waits like a gate. End with the pursuers overwhelmed, the supply trains captured, and a king preserved, not by numbers, but by the concentration of purpose.
In the end, the day's drama can be read in two registers, the immediate and the enduring. Immediately, it was a tactical triumph, surprise executed, terrain exploited, discipline imposed upon a larger, dispersed enemy. Enduringly, it was a narrative event, a story that traveled home and changed how a continent thought about war, leadership, and the reach of divine or human favor. The image of 500 knights standing like a blade against an army's flank did not merely thrill medieval audiences, it taught them to ask new questions about power and to fund new hopes for the crusading cause. When modern audiences look back, the scene remains cinematic. A leprous king, riders in mail, lances colliding in dust, ravines funneling retreat, a ruler mounting a camel and slipping away as his banners fall. But the lessons are not romantic abstractions. They are hard, tactical truths. Mobility can trump mass when applied with surprise. Logistics can be both strength and weakness. Leadership can cohere disparate men into momentary miracles. Terrain can transform numbers into liabilities. That is why the story carried beyond its immediate geography, and why nothing in contemporary European experience quite prepared men for the sight of a tiny force undoing a great army's plan. For those who want to dig deeper, translations of contemporary chroniclers, Christian and Muslim alike, offer first-hand prismatic views of the day, colored by motive and perspective. Modern military historians provide careful reconstructions, grounded in archaeology and logistics, rather than rhetoric alone. If you want sources and suggested readings, check the links in the description for translations and scholarly analyses.
If this account resonated with you, subscribe for more deep dives into the battles that reshaped medieval history, and share this with someone who loves how strategy, leadership, and geography can converge to make the improbable happen.